Welcome, everybody. I'm Dunja Krause, Research Officer at the UN Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, that hosts the Just Transition Research Collaborative. And this is the third session in our webinar series, Nature, Labor, and the Struggle for an Eco-Social World, which we're co-organizing with the Center for Environmental Justice at Colorado State University, the European Trade Union Institute, the Global Labor University, and the University of Sao Paulo. This series asks, is there a gap between labor and nature, or are workers and their communities engaging with nature to work towards environmental justice and a just transition? It draws on some of the many rich examples and in-depth case studies presented in the recently published Palgrave Handbook of Environmental Labor Studies to analyze the challenges working people face when struggling for eco-social justice within a neoliberal extractivist political economy. We already had one session on resistance and alternatives to extractive industries, and a second one on the challenges and perspectives of a just transition in Europe. Today, we will discuss working class environmentalism and just transition struggles in the Americas. The final session on environmental labor and justice perspectives from the Global South will take place on the 4th of April. In case you're interested to learn more about the other sessions or the handbook itself, we'll put some additional information into the chat box shortly. Before we start today's discussion, allow me to make some brief announcements. The housekeeping. This session will be recorded and live streamed via the UNRISD YouTube channel, where it will remain available afterwards. You will see that we have enabled both a general chat box at the bottom of your screen, as well as a Q&A box. We do invite you to pose any questions that you have directly for one or several of our speakers into the Q&A box, and to put any general comments or information you would like to share into the chat box. You're also very welcome to use the chat box to briefly introduce yourselves. Finally, we will be very grateful if you could take a minute at the very end of the session to fill in a very short feedback survey that should pop up when you leave to help us evaluate the quality of our events. But let's get started. We will first hear 3 presentations from contributors to the handbook, and then have a discussant who will reflect on what we just heard and help us switch into the discussion mode. I will introduce them one by one as we move along. We should then have some time left for questions and answers from the audience before we wrap up with some very short reflections from 2 of the handbook editors, David Ussel and Dimitri Stevis, who are also here with us today. So moving over to our first presenter, Bruno Dobrusin is a labor and climate justice organizer in Toronto in Canada. He's the Just Transition Project coordinator at the International Transport Workers Federation and also the former coordinator of the Green Economy Network, an alliance of unions, environmental, community, and faith-based groups fighting for ambitious climate action in Canada. Previously, he was an advisor at the Workers' Confederation of Argentina. His chapter in the handbook is entitled A Just Transition for All, a debate on the limits and potentials of a just transition in Canada. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dunya. Thank you very much. And great to see everyone. Some familiar faces, some new faces. I'm very happy to be here and to be given this opportunity to present on the chapter that I wrote for the handbook. Just as a clarification, I am working for the ITF right now, but the handbook doesn't really, my chapter doesn't deal with transport workers. We're doing work on just transition and transport workers. So anybody who wants to connect on that, feel free to do so. It's just that this presentation will focus on my previous engagement with the issue in the context of Canada and Canadian trade unions. So just like everywhere else around the world, the issue of climate and the positions of workers has been a very heated discussion over the last 10 years or so. And in the case of the chapter that I have in the book, I'm focusing on how that discussion has been taking place in the context of Canada. And I do it in a way that contrasts 2 different ways to look at just transition, basically to look at the role of workers in the transition to a low carbon economy. One is analyzing what is called the Just Transition Task Force for coal workers, which was created by the Canadian government in 2017, started and engaged a broad process of consultation with coal workers. About 8,000 workers were affected by the phase out of coal in Canada. And it's a task force that focused on what were the demands and the needs of these groups of workers, specifically, again, looking at coal, and what were the realities that they were facing with the phase out of coal. So that's one part of the chapter that I look at, and I put that in the characteristic of what is called a worker-focused approach, and I'll discuss that a little bit more towards the end. The other example that I deal with in the chapter, it's a broader understanding of just transition that comes from the 15 and Fairness campaign in the province of Ontario, which is a campaign originally focused on a $15 minimum wage for Ontario workers, and very much focused on the service sector, but that increasingly started to have a climate angle to its campaign and started speaking about just transition in broader terms. So not just looking at the specific situations of fossil fuel workers, but also looking at community groups that are affected by the transition, at Indigenous people that are affected by the energy transition, as well as what happens to the low carbon jobs that we are talking about. What are the working conditions of those workers? Why do we need decent work for those low carbon jobs? And how are we going to fight for that? In making this comparison, what I'm arguing is that we basically need to come to an understanding that is not just focused on the specific group of fossil fuel workers, although it's very important to obviously incorporate them when we're talking about just transition, but we need to also take a broader picture and look at what's happening around those workers, what's happening with the communities, and what's happening as well with the jobs that we are promoting as the jobs of the future, the low carbon jobs that these workers could move into. So I think that's why I like to compare those two situations in the Canadian case. Fortunately, towards the end of the paper, when I was writing the paper, we had the opportunity to have that discussion between those two groups in what was called the Pact for a Green New Deal. And this was towards 2019, when the Canadian federal elections, when the issue of climate really became central. And the Pact for a Green New Deal was very much trying to emulate what was happening in the US around the proposals for a Green New Deal. And it was an effort from different civil society organizations, including unions, to come to an agreement on what would be a platform for a Green New Deal in Canada. And in the case of this issue of just transitions particularly, it kind of confronted those two perspectives. There were a lot of unions from the fossil fuel sector that were hesitant to participate in broader alliances because they felt that their needs and the needs of the fossil fuel workers may be made secondary in the context of a broader alliance of just transition. And then there were Indigenous group, community groups that were saying we need an understanding that goes beyond these workers. We need to have these workers participate in discussions that go beyond as well their own communities and think of a broader picture approach. Basically, the paper tries to come up with a unified vision for these two perspectives. I think on the ground, whenever we have engaged workers and communities, that unified vision tends to be there. It's just that sometimes organizations create perhaps more differences than what may be on the ground. A good example in the case of Canada is that a lot of the fossil fuel projects are also happening on Indigenous lands and include Indigenous communities. And fossil fuel workers are very aware of those dynamics. And when those conversations happen at the local level, I think we might get much more concrete and honest discussions on what the future could look like. I don't think any of the communities that are part of those projects will deny the agency and the role that the fossil fuel workers have to play in the transition. I think the Canadian case is a good case to think about the tensions that sometimes we have in the labor movement between focusing specifically on worker issues and then focusing as well on more systemic issues, and how we try to negotiate between those two, negotiate between the views of the workers in the workplace and the very immediate needs that they're going to have, because as in the case of Canada, they're going to be phased out of their jobs in many cases, but also the more systemic views on how we not only need to transition those workers into a new job, but also how those new jobs need to challenge profit motives. They need to be low carbon, but as well promote energy democracy. They need to take a systemic view on how we exploit natural resources in general, not just talking about fossil fuels. And this exercise is something that we need to get more and more into in the labor movement. And I think that is happening slowly in different areas. And if you're interested on the chapter in Canada, I think it's going to help you perhaps think about in your own work in your union, or if you're part of a social movement or an environmental organization, on how these two perspectives that may not look like possible to reconcile can be reconciled in the context of a broader project that it's very inclusive of the differences, if that makes sense. So I'm going to leave it there, but I'm really curious to hear the other speakers and then listen to your comments and questions after this. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Bruno. That sounds fascinating. And as you already pointed out, super relevant for, I think, most other places in the world where we are trying to grapple with exactly these tensions between different groups and how to protect different people's needs and come to like a more unified vision towards of some kind of either Green New Deal or just transition, but alternative future, different future that can reconcile really the challenges that we face with social and environmental crises. Just a reminder, if you have any questions specifically addressed to Bruno, please do already go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. We will collect all questions for the speakers during the presentations, and then I will pick up some of them during the Q&A slot afterwards. Now, our second presentation moves us to Brazil, where Beatriz Leandro has done work on connecting individual trajectories and resistance movements in Brazil. That's a chapter she co-authored with Patricia Vieira Tropia and Nora Retzel in the handbook. Beatriz holds a master's degree in international humanitarian law and in social sciences. She was the researcher responsible for Brazil in the project Moments of Danger, Moments of Opportunity, funded by the Swedish Research Council, and she also edited the book Water for Life, Ecumenical Action for Rights and Common Goods in Brazil and Latin America. Beatriz, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tunja. So I'm going to talk briefly about our chapter that you correctly said that was written in 6 hands, as we say in Portuguese. Where we analyze resistance against environmental degradation in Brazil in a context of agribusiness that it is expanding capitalist relations of protection in the countryside. Just a quick note, when we wrote this article like a year and a half ago, we were already under Bolsonaro, right? Who was Marina Silva, our former Minister of Environment, said he was the exterminator of the future. So situation now has worsened significantly, but also looking at the glass half full, also like resistance from civil society has also improved a lot, which is great. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of it, about it at the end of this presentation. So what we did was we analyzed data of all the protests that happened here and how they try to redefine development and build an alternative model of agriculture based on social justice, ecological sustainability, and respect for culture, land, and territories, which is very crucial for especially indigenous peoples, right? Because their land and their bodies, their territories, it's all one big thing, one connection, one huge connection. As Bruno said in Canada, right? The petrol industry goes to indigenous lands, and it's the same harm that is inflicted upon our indigenous native peoples. And then we analyzed life stories of rural workers who resisted environmental degradation by organizing other workers. And this part of the article is due to this project that you mentioned in University of Humboldt, that we did this, Nora, Ratzel, and David, they led this really important and outstanding work. Anyway, So let's carry on. Right. As highlighted by Nora, Ratzel, and David, in the global south, ecologism is often agrarian. I don't know if I said it right. And comprising movements for whom nature is an essential ally of the work and life. For instance, here, 50 million of hectares of land in Brazil are public lands, and these are the most disputed ones, because since political power and economical power have always gone hand in hand, public lands are always in dispute. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk briefly about the largest social movement in Brazil, which is the landless workers movement, Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Terra, which was created under, sorry, my son is messy here, was created under the influence of liberation theology. For those who don't know what liberation theology is, we could roughly explain it was like a left-wing arm of the Catholic Church that resisted oppression, military dictatorship, and because of that, a lot of priests were exiled, arrested, murdered by military dictatorships in South America, especially here, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. So they were brave people and priests. And like most Brazilian militants, including those for other social movements and unionism, they have inserted Christian beliefs into their struggles. For instance, land for the landless, food for the hungry, literacy for the uneducated, and not through charitable work, which is crucial and more important, but by forcing the state to take seriously its responsibilities for its poorest citizens. So during military, I'm sorry, I'm talking about back then, but it has a connection to now, right? As well. It's huge, this connection between faith and economic and political power back then and now with Bolsonaro. So even though liberation theology was developed under specific historical circumstances in Latin America, since such as, dependent capitalism, mass poverty, popular religiosity, the Cuban Revolution. Now it's as well. We are under dependent capitalism. Mass poverty has grew. Brazil, we had left the map of hunger, the world map of hunger. Now we're almost back there. And anyway, so let's carry on. Well, so the landless movement of workers has led more than 2,500 land occupations, and they have settled on about 7.5 million hectares of land that they won as a result of these occupations. Even though they have done that, they have conquered all this lands and everything, even though the agricultural sector is controlled by giant corporations, right? And both national and multinational. And in our parliament, in our Congress, they have like a group of senators and deputies, and they are called the rural bloc or the cattle bloc. And these people, these politicians, now they are like the biggest allies of Bolsonaro, right? So that makes things much difficult, much more difficult, and much more bleak. Not only that, but Bolsonaro has also implemented like a significant change in our environmental policies and our international posturing regarding Amazon deforestation. So not only he's been a disaster for Brazil, Brazil's young democracy, but also for the planet. So what I'm going to talk, don't you know how many minutes do I have left?
You have 3 minutes.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. It's going so quickly. Right. So I wanted to talk about our interviews. I'm going to just pick one thing.
I can give you 5 max.
Obrigada. So in our life story interviews, we interviewed lots of people, but I'm going to just talk about one woman. She's amazing. And that's why we cannot use her real name, because she was one of the women from Via Campesina, who they invaded like a cellulose, a cellulose nursery from Aracruz, which is like a huge company that produces transgenic seeds and all of the bad stuff. They're the bad guys. So a bunch of women from Via Campesina, they invaded this nursery to destroy these transgenic seeds. And she is one example of how faith and politics they go together, because she was born in the south of Brazil, in the countryside. She moved to the city, to the big capital, major city there, and she was working as a housemaid at the age of 14. And then she realized she was really exploited. She didn't get any wages, you know, she didn't have working hours. And she joined the youth pastoral, which is like an arm of the Catholic Church for the youth. And then she said, here, I just wrote something. She said that just the church she could just reach the church because unions or political organizations would not go to housemates. So that was the door, her entrance to her political activity and organization. And she said that the struggle for rights began there, and all the social security rights that rural working women have, such as social security, maternity pay, retirement, they all want there, organized, right? So, and another thing she says, I'm going to quote her. She said, "Today, the exploitation takes many forms. Today, the enemy has another face. The state is dominated by big groups. We all saw that. It's the big capital that is exploiting us. There are few companies dominating the seeds, fertilizers, remedies, food marketing." And that's when she says, they don't call it poison, because people were also educated to say fertilizer, to say fungicide, to say it's not poison. And that was when the transgenic seeds came, right? It's like the hegemony that Gramsci says, that capital has that overwhelming power. So finally, I might have like 2 minutes. I just wanted to tell you guys what's going on here in this nightmare. We have been living for almost 4 years under Bolsonaro, even though all this horrible stuff is done. Civil society is really strong. Last year, we had the biggest march of Indigenous women in Brasilia to protest against these ludicrous and horrible laws and projects. This year, we are going to have in May, from 25th until 27th of May, we're going to have this People's Summit, Rio Plus 30, because it's been 30 years since ECHO 92. It's been 50 years since Stockholm. And we have everybody, the Landless Workers Movement, the Indigenous organizations, Greenpeace, movement for housing and women's movements. And in July, in the middle of July, we're going to have the social Pan-Amazonic Forum in Belém do Pará, in the heart of the Amazon, with all these organizations. So in Brazil, this year is going to be very important for us to fight all the setbacks and move forward as civil society. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much for wrapping up on time, even though it's a really engaging story. I can see how you would have many more things to say about the struggle. I hope we can come back to some of the points, and maybe some of the audience can also already put some questions into the Q&A box in case they want to hear more on specific elements of what you have just presented. From Brazil, we are now moving over to Ecuador, where Sarah Latour is with us, who is a professor at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Ecuador. Her research work has focused on the study of environmental popular social movements and conflicts in relation to Ecuadorian environmental inequalities from a political ecology and ecological economic perspective. The chapter she wrote for the handbook is called The Role of Ecuadorian Working Class Environmentalism in Promoting Environmental Justice, an overview of the hydrocarbon and agricultural sectors. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the editors of this handbook for inviting me to participate in the book and the organizer of this interesting panel. It's a pleasure to be part of it. I'm going to present, I don't know, I can't, okay. What I'm going to present is an analysis of the environmental politics of the labor organizations in the agricultural and oil sectors in terms of how they incorporate an environmental agenda. I have chosen these two sectors because are the most relevant as the Ecuadorian economy relies on agro exports and oil revenues. Okay. I use the term working class environmentalism, environmental justice, and popular environmentalisms as synonyms, meaning subaltern classes that mobilize in defense of the environment in which they work, live, or from which they gain their livelihoods. However, they can articulate different collective identities such as ethnicity, gender, or class-based identities. And it's important to mention that the literature normally study peasants and indigenous struggles as expression of new agrarian social movements rather than labor issues. So regarding the Ecuadorian political economy, it's important to say that Ecuador has a primary economy, and the main main agri-food exports are shrimps, banana, palm oil, and coffee and cocoa that are located in the coast, and flowers in the highlands. It also has a very unequal agrarian structure, and as you can see in these maps, oil production is concentrated in the Amazon. Moving on to the agrarian labor movement, the main rural organizations emerged in the late 60s with a class-based agenda, mainly land and water distribution. Well, it's important also to mention that one of these organizations, Ecuador, he also had an ethnic agenda from the very beginning. So during the neoliberalism, an ecological agrarian issue emerged, incorporating different demands such as gender equality, acknowledgement of cultural diversity and traditional knowledge, and the promotion of agroecological agrarian technologies. However, this ecological agrarian agenda was framed in two main discourses: the food sovereignty and the plurinational state. So these class-based organizations adopted this food sovereignty, but also they are internationally allied with the Via Campesina, and the indigenous organizations adopted the plurinational state discourse. And during the post-neoliberalism, it's important because food sovereignty discourse was institutionalized, but mainly reflected the government visions, which was a productivist and a conservative project. But these class-based organizations gave the government their support, mainly the plantations workers and the commercially export-oriented producers, which they don't have like a radical position against agribusiness. However, critical voices were delegitimized and criminalized, mainly the indigenous organizations. And regarding to the anti-oil labor movement, the three main actors, which are indigenous, mestizo settlers, and the Public Oil Union, emerged in the 80s in the context of the expansion of the oil commodity frontiers in the Amazon. And they positioned, each of them positioned a different agenda. Indigenous actors demand like opposition as like a strict opposition to the expansion of the oil frontiers, plus ethnic rights, mainly rights to the territory and the prior consultations. The mestizo settlers raise an environmental justice agenda in the all oil frontiers, because since the 60s, I mean, the northern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon has a lot of liabilities from the Texaco Gulf era and many other oil companies that are working there. And the Public Oil Union position a national oil sovereignty and an environmental critic, emphasizing that foreign companies obtain the economic benefits at the expense of the Ecuadorian, who are left with the environmental liabilities. And during the post-neoliberalism, until 2011, there was some institutional permeability, like the constitutions recognize the rights of nature, and in the context of a post-development legal framework frame as good living, the initiative Yasuni ITT was created. Also an environmental fund for socio-environmental restorations, and some progressive national economic policies were implemented. However, from 2012 onwards, the government promoted a neo-extractivist agenda. So again, critical voices were delegitimized and criminalized, and mainly the indigenous actors, and mestizo settlers and the Public Oil Union was demobilized, mainly because part of their demands were adopted by the government. But it's important because the indigenous actors have, during the last years, have been positioned what is called indigenous cosmopolitics, which in terms of Marisol de la Cadena means the positioning of indigenous ontologies that recognize nature as sentient and humans as inextricably connected to nature as alternative to dominant economic models. There are two main projects in the Amazon, and these two projects also have been positioned in several climate change conference of parts. And just to conclude, I just want to emphasize that in both cases, indigenous and peasants organizations are leading the struggle for environmental justice, and explicit environmental priorities are interlinked with cultural diversity and autonomy demands. And like regarding the agrarian labor movement, like one particular point in this case is that all actors converge on this ecological agrarian question, but there was some disagreement in the content. So there are two versions of these ecological agrarian questions. The radical one which stress the promotion of a peasant-based agroecological productive model. And this is associated mainly to landless and poor land peasants organizations, and the moderate one that agrees with agribusiness and agro-exports, but complemented with better environmental working conditions and better markets. It's supported by plantation workers and commercially exported oriented peasants. And regarding to the oil labor movement, there are mainly two main demands that also are connected to ethnic and race differences. The first one is the abandonment of the oil exploitations to move to a post-carbon economy and a post-development agenda, which is raised by the indigenous organizations. And the other one is the state-led oil exploitations with better rent distribution and better environmental management that has been supported by the mestizos and the oil union organizations. Generally speaking, the Ecuadorian legal framework reflects to some extent these moderate positions in the oil and in the agricultural sectors, but there's not exist the political conditions to advance a radical pro-environmental and pro-labor structural change now. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that's really insightful. Interesting to see how the pieces come together, even we are talking about quite different contexts. Now, having heard these fairly diverse cases and insights based on the 3 chapters, I will now invite Ecuador Marina to offer his reflections and to get us kick-started with a more interactive discussion. Edouard is a lecturer in French Studies and International Politics at the University of London Institute in Paris, and also co-coordinator of the Just Transition Research Collaborative. His current research concentrates on the social and justice dimensions of climate action through a focus on non-state actors' involvement in the international climate debate. Edouard, what do you make of the interventions you just heard? Over to you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's a lot to say. I mean, first of all, I really like to thank Beatrice, Sarah, and Bruno for both their interventions today, but also for their chapters, which I had a lot of pleasure reading. I mean, I think that the 3 chapters in the handbook make really interesting, kind of rich and valuable contributions to the kind of broader debates around this kind of idea, I guess, of working class environmentalism. And I guess my comment is more, I mean, rather than kind of going through each paper, I guess my comment is maybe a more kind of cross-cutting one, which actually relates to this notion of working class environmentalism, which I find interesting in and of itself. And in a way, what I feel, kind of having read the 3 chapters, I mean, I wasn't able to read the rest of the handbook, but I'm sure there are other kind of interesting insights to be found there. What I find particularly interesting is how, I guess, this notion even of working class environmentalism challenges to a certain extent traditional understandings of, you know, what is and what is not the working class. And I felt that that's really something that came out throughout the 3 chapters, but also through the contributions. So effectively, this kind of idea that the environmentalism or the environmental crisis and efforts to respond to it are indirectly contributing to kind of redefining a new collective identity for the oppressed and the exploited. Again, it's something that I felt was present throughout these 3 chapters. And so effectively, I guess the question we can ask ourselves is, you know, to what extent does the kind of traditional kind of understanding of the working class, which has traditionally been kind of associated with particular forms of organizing, working class organization, particular kind of trade unions, the labor movement more generally, to what extent are they still kind of relevant in the current context, which is marked by, you know, the environmental and climate crisis, you know, and And so I feel that, the papers provide kind of interesting insights into kind of contemporary efforts to construct what we could call maybe a new kind of working class identity that places environmental stewardship at its heart. And if I'm just quickly to go through some of the kind of terms, I mean, what I find really, really interesting when I was reading the three chapters is how in the different chapters there are kind of references to different terms. Different terms are used to actually qualify, the groups or the individuals that are engaged in these processes of identity or creation. So we have references to, this notion of subaltern classes that Sarah just referred to, references to the poor, in relation to this notion of environmentalism of the poor, references to peasants, including kind of landless peasants, references to kind of more traditional kind of wage labor, but also to non-wage labor, kind of focus as well on kind of day-to-day struggles, and also, this references to precarious workers, so which also Bruno refers to in his text. He talks about undocumented, excluded, unemployed workers. Another aspect that I find interesting is also kind of references throughout the three texts to kind of multiple identities. So there are references to gender, to religion, to culture, ethnic identities. I guess in addition to, and sometimes, I mean, I don't think in replacement of, but in addition to, let's say, the kind of more traditional class identities that you would generally associate with the working class. What I also find throughout the text is this kind of idea that groups who are pushing these new working class identities or environmental kind of working class identities are kind of united by common enemies. So neoliberal globalization is referred to, multinationals, agribusiness, big capital was also referred to just now, and also new oppositions, so kind of oppositions between food sovereignty and agribusiness, between the rich and the poor, between the local and the global, between, it's not necessarily phrased in that way, but this kind of idea of, an authentic lifestyles or kind of a proximity with nature and kind of the artificial, between urban and rural as well, to a certain extent, between big and small. And what's interesting with these oppositions, which are, again, I mean, they're directly, but I feel they're or indirectly kind of presented in these texts, is that they seem to transcend or move away from kind of the traditional, capital versus labor opposition that has kind of structured working class politics for so long. And so, in a sense, they're also kind of interrogating its continued relevance. And at the same time, and throughout these chapters, what was also interesting to see was how challenging it was as well to construct this new kind of working class identity kind of centered around environmental action. And so, the authors present really well the challenges, the contradictions, the tensions that emerge in this process of constructing a new collective identity around which to mobilize, and how there's also a form of resistance on behalf of the kind of more traditional labor groups for whom the kind of traditional opposition as well between labor and capital, or that kind of framing, is still relevant. And so I feel that these efforts and these to construct these new collective identities and the challenges that are associated with them, I feel they're reflective also of the kind of current historical juncture that we are in, and then the current phase of capitalist development. So I would argue even that it goes beyond just the kind of environmental and climate crisis. It's reflective as well of a certain moment, in our kind of collective history, a moment that's characterized by, growing trade liberalization, the breakdown of the welfare state in the global north, the growing power of multinational corporations, deepening inequalities, the growing role of finance, and the mobility of financial capital, but also, and I guess this is even possibly the most also what's most relevant when it comes to constructing kind of new popular or working class identities, the reconfigurations that we're also seeing in the world of work, this kind of growing precariousness and fragmentation of the labor force, the development of, the gig economy in the global north, but also to a certain extent in the global south, the kind of growing mobility of the workforce, the constant need or the growing need for people to combine different types of employment, and the return of a form of self-exploitation, and this is particularly characteristic of the gig economy, where workers are autonomous. You're kind of self-employed, you're your own boss, and therefore you also exploit yourself. And in the global south as well, to a certain extent, a number of the two of the texts were very focused on kind of agrarian contexts, and I think what's also interesting to note in these contexts is how peasant farmers in the global south are increasingly being forced to not only kind of combine work on their own farms, but also to combine that work with salaried work elsewhere, work in the city, work in, the farm of a big landowner, for example. So these kind of reconfigurations of the world of work also represent a big challenge when it comes to kind of developing a new kind of collective identity for the working class in the kind of context of the Anthropocene. And I felt that, and I'll just stop there. I felt that these three chapters really kind of make kind of an interesting and important contribution, through their focus, their very detailed focus on different kind of national contexts. I felt that they really highlight some of both the, I guess, the hopes, but also some of the big challenges that are kind of associated with this process of, building this kind of working class environmentalism.
Thank you so much, Edouard. I think that's a really good starting point for our discussion. I think you highlight a lot of the commonalities between the different papers, but also we're coming back to the tensions that Bruno had already mentioned at the beginning, that we see between different groups in this really difficult context of neoliberalism, of the gig economy, trade liberalization, all the things that you've just mentioned. So I think it's really interesting to see how you describe this new working class identity. I'm wondering, is that what we need now to achieve a just transition for all? And how do we then make sure that we don't lose the traditional working class on the way? How do we bring them in? I think we have a lot of things to talk about, and I'll let the speakers now react to Edouard's intervention first. Maybe if you could each just try and stick to 1 minute or so for the first reaction while I go through the questions that we've already received in the Q&A box, and then I'll pose questions to you one after the other. Beatrice, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Edouard. I really enjoyed your comments. And when you say that all these, the workers, and they're all united by common enemies, and there is a new grammar of labor, right, of actors. And it just reminded me of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, and their motto was a world where mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world that fits a lot of worlds, right? Does it make sense? And just a quick note, I think the traditional actors, labor actors, like the unions, even though they have had some setbacks, I think they're growing very strong now again. They're regaining their strength, so to say. So well, that's it.
Thank you. Bruno, what are your reactions to Edouard's intervention?
I went through many as I heard him, but I was thinking about how because of the conflicts that we have in many political spaces, I think sometimes we become a little bit afraid of polarized positions and dealing with polarization in an honest way that can get us to a synthesis. And maybe what I see, I share, I heard it from Edward, and it made me think about the 3 papers is the conflict. We need to recognize conflict in order to get to that synthesis too. And I think the 3 papers speak about how that conflict manifests itself in different ways. My reinforced idea is, let's embrace it and not be afraid of it, even especially when it happens between potential allies. I think that's a big challenge, but that we shouldn't shy away from it. But thank you, Edward, for making that very clear in my mind, at least.
Thank you, Bruno. Sarah, I'll leave the last reaction to you.
Yes, I agree on what Beatriz and Bruno have said. I would say that I think that like class identities and seeing these commonalities is really important. But again, there are like other social categories that has to be recognized and understood in order to find like discourses or an agenda that unifies the different movements and organizations, because at least in Ecuador, it's really, really, I mean, important to understand like not only class, but also ethnic, race inequalities and how they interlink with environmental injustices. So I think that like moving towards a transition or just transitions has to recognize all these divisions and specificities as well.
Yeah, I really loved listening, first of all, to your presentations, and then Edouard kind of making really the great links between the different contexts, because I think it's something that is so crucial, in really connecting these different struggles and somehow finding a way to struggle together, or even a little bit against each other first, but then together, and kind of really identifying that common enemy. And I think that'll require a lot of work also, because at the international level, they're just kind of completely separate arenas sometimes, where some of these discussions are being held. And I mean, just transition is still very dominated by one narrative in these international settings, and we don't really hear from other movements that have very much to say and contribute to the debates. So I think that's really interesting. I think I already noted down a lot of my own question, but I don't want to abuse my position as the moderator, so I'll first go through the ones that we've received from participants. And we have actually questions for all of you. I'll start. Nora, who is also a handbook editor, for full disclosure, has a couple of questions where she would like to hear more insights. First, Bruno, she's asking, could you give some examples about the differences or conflicts that were discussed in those meetings between workers and other groups or organizations?
Yeah, so there were many. I think perhaps the most interesting were the ones that took place around the Pact for a Green New Deal discussions. And they have to do with a lot of what we just mentioned. So who is a worker? Is a worker just a worker? Is also a worker, an inhabitant of a given community, that they also have other rights and other identities to incorporate. I think a big one, in a very concrete difference, was how willing were the social and environmental movements to have in the platform no more fossil fuels, no more fossil fuel extraction, so like a hard deadline. Well, a lot of the unions were more in favor of something along the lines of a phase out, but that we don't shut down the industry right away. And that was a very heated discussion. And I think both sides had very strong points. That was a big red flag. And I think it's one that we didn't come to an agreement on. It was probably one of the biggest challenges to figure out. It led to a lot of unions being more hesitant to join the coalition. That's one. But I think the other one is about distribution politics, as Edward mentioned. Governments and employers play a lot with the idea that we have limited resources. So if we're going to provide a support program, let's say for transitioning workers, those are resources that are not going to go somewhere else into the communities that need it, or to patch the areas that were polluted, contaminated. So who's going to get those resources? And when they put you in that context, it can get very competitive. And I think that is the challenge, is not to fall into those narratives. But that was definitely one of the issues that happened. A lot of the social movements were rightly questioned, why are we going to focus on male, middle class, white male, middle class jobs, and not on the communities that live maybe 5 or 10 kilometers from them? Why so much focus on it? And so that was definitely another big difference that took place. I think that one had more of a closure, in the sense of the unions were willing to argue for enlarging the resources, not just narrowing down on it. I think the one on fossil fuels more generally is still a challenge to this day.
Yes, and I mean, not only in Canada, obviously, we struggle with that everywhere. But yeah, thank you very much for highlighting that. That's really interesting to have a more concrete example. Nora has a question for Beatrice as well. How is the relationship between liberation theology and the social movements today? And what is the relationship between the landless movement and trade unions? Or better, is there a relationship between the landless movement and any kind of trade union?
Yeah, thanks, Nora, for the question. I'll start with the second part. We have the Workers' Party, right, who ruled the country for 13 years, more or less. So the Workers' Party were founded in the 80s, along with the landless workers movement and our biggest trade union, which is CUT, the Workers' Central. So they are like this tripod of organizations that represent. So they have like a huge, very straight connection. The first one was liberation theology. I think it's embroidered in them, in the organization. Liberation theology. It's completely. They are invested by the beliefs, and it's part of them now, of their identity even. And I feel that's why Pope Francis has been so important, because he said, I even Googled it. He said, hey, to the priests, you have to have your feet in the mud. You have to smell the sheep, because he said for decades the church, the Catholic Church, was disconnected from like the basis, right? The peasants, peoples, everybody. So he said that to reconnect with this, to do this base work, this groundwork that they did back then in the 70s, 80s as well. And a last thing was, and the synod for the Amazon that he promoted here was very important as well, to reunite all the organizations and social movements and indigenous organizations against the common enemy, right? As I don't know if Bruno also had said. So yeah, I think, and as a last thing, I think Pope Francis, he brought back this liberation theology spirit, of being more down to earth, right? Like literally, as he said, you have to have your feet dirty with mud. And well, I think that's about it. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I think it's a really interesting example that, at least for me personally, I often neglect a little bit the influence that faith-based organizations have. And I think it's really relevant to see also the change in popes and how that shifted the narrative for quite a large group of people, because there is this very, like also with Laudato Si and like all of these kind of really writings to change things on the ground. I think that's really interesting. Sarah, we have two questions for you. One from Su Ming Ku, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, saying that it's a very interesting presentation and the first time they've seen the division of neoliberal and post-neoliberal. very informative to see the three groups: indigenous, mestizo, settler, and public extractive labor. So the question is, what is the main driver of the transition from neoliberal to post-neoliberal regime? Can you say a little bit about that? And then maybe the second one already from Nora, what is the position of the recently elected government to the more radical or the more modest demands?
Okay, well, these divisions between neoliberal and post-neoliberal, it's like quite contentious, but the main difference is the role of the state in comparison with the foreign companies. In the sense that in the oil sectors, like in the post-neoliberal period, there has been a great share of revenues from the extractions towards redistribution, especially where oil production takes place. Also, the public companies have been strengthened, and the government has obtained more royalties. This is like the main differences, because like in both periods, the extractivist agenda has been maintained. So it's called neo because of the role of the state, or the greater role of the state in promoting at least this neo extractivist agenda. And in terms in the agricultural sectors, there's no like much difference. Mainly in the neoliberal period, there has been an increasing of the domestic productions and productivity, and also stimulating this agro-industrial processing sector, but I think this is worldwide, like in the context of these nutritional also transitions, where the processed and ultra-processed products are getting dominance. And also the agro-export commodities has been strengthened. And regarding the other questions, I think that the new elected government, I mean, I think he has fostered a more open neoliberal agenda, but the dialogue, like even if it's a pro-neoliberal government, the confrontations against the social organizations has been reduced. And there is much more dialogue between the government and the organizations that didn't happen in the post-neoliberal period. But again, agribusiness and agro-exports has been strengthened, and labor and environmental protectionist legislation has been relaxed, or is more relaxed now.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question in the direction of Brazil and Ecuador. Karen Ashike is saying the US Department of Agriculture is addressing the issue of non-sustainable farm and animal feed practices with work to break up monopolies of big agro and factory farming. Much of Brazil's agriculture grows animal feeds, and the US changes will undermine Brazil's large farms. As land in the US turns to small farms, can food growing in Brazil and other nations by small farmers, can food growing in Brazil and other nations by small farmers support food security in Central and South America if farmers are no longer under attack by your government and big business? Will government support regional markets and sustainable supply to workers, people in your area and region? Maybe Beatrice, you can say just a very quick thing, because I know that you have to leave us very soon. And then we'll hand to Sarah after.
Yeah, definitely. Small farmers can provide for food. In fact, 70% of the food that we normal Brazilians eat every day, it's produced by small farmers, right? So we can drink, how would you say? We can calmly feed everybody. Just like these giant corporations, they not only exploit the land and workers, but they are the basis of our economy, right? Which is completely wrong based, and that's where they take their profit from. But yeah, you're completely capable of doing that.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and thank you again for your presentation. I know you have to leave us a bit early. Sarah, do you want to add some reflections from your side?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Beatrice that I think at least in Ecuador, peasants can, I mean, we already have like food sovereignty. We only import like wheat or some fruits that, I mean, that maybe Chile or other countries produce cheaper, but the peasants actually guarantee our food sovereignty, like the agribusiness produced for exportation. So this is not, I mean, the main problem now, but we face like structural problems in terms of the last, like most peasant producers are over the 60s, so we are like getting an older population, and youngers don't want to I don't know, to follow their parents, so they don't want to cultivate anymore. And also there is like a division of the land and the water. So I think without distribution of land and water resources, this, like in the future, this will be very difficult to keep producing. But at the moment, well, we have seen during the COVID period that were the peasants who basically provide cities and Ecuadorians like food. So yeah, this is really important.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you again to all of you speakers. Before we close, we will now ask two of our handbook editors to share their reflections. David Azul, I will hand over to you first. And
okay, right. Thank you.
Take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Dunya. That was a wonderful session. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I'll make a couple of very, very quick comments. Obviously can't do justice to what's been said today. But Bruno, at the very beginning of his presentation, made the point that what is happening with regards to workers and work affects not just workers, but also the surrounding communities. And so it seems to me, just transition for workers is also just transition for communities. And so there are, if you like, there are multiplier effects there, which are perhaps not sufficiently acknowledged, argued, or built upon. And I think this is something that comes out of the papers that were presented today, and certainly in some of the handbook chapters. And it was also in part, I think, picked up by Edouard in the comments he made at the end, where he was talking about working class identity and creating new identities. And this reminded me of something that Beatrice wrote in her chapter in the book, where she talked about members of exploited rural communities can become organic intellectuals of social resistance movements by connecting arrays of conflicts and finding their common origins. And I think something that Edouard was talking about in terms of this notion of collective identities, or if you like, a working class environmental identity, is very important here. But the only point I would make there, it goes back to some work that I did many, many years ago, looking at environment, looking at identities, and the whole discussion about, can we have different identities, or is there just one particular identity? And I think that plays out into this whole issue of treating the environment and work as some kind of binary. And it's really necessary that if there is a working class identity, it incorporates the environment. It's not something you can sort of buy into. It's part of the identity is environmental, and part of how an environmental identity is to do with work. So I just leave it with that comment.
Thank you very much. I think that really ties back the questions that we've discussed today quite well with some of this jobs versus environment binary that we talk a lot about when we talk about just transition. Dimitris, I also want to give you the floor to share your reflections on this session and also how it ties back to the effort of the handbook.
Well, thank you very much all for your contribution, Edward's comments. One of the things I have learned from these chapters, but also from the whole experience of co-editing the handbook, is that in order to broaden environmental labor studies, it's important to be open to different people and natures in particular places, but also to look at different places and the connections amongst themselves, because that, I think, reveals a lot of insights that may not be clear if we don't take the world as a whole. I also learned a great deal, and that came out through in the presentations, that we need to broaden the universe of the working class. And I think that can be helped a great deal by looking at working people from around the world in different capacities, different skills. And that there's a variety of diverse trajectories and experiences that link and converge towards environmental labor studies and practice. So those were the lessons that I learned from co-editing the handbook, but also from your interventions today and the comments that were made. And it has been a kind of a growing and enlightening experience, and I appreciate the opportunity to express that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think from all of us also a big thanks to you, David and Nora, for going through the effort of editing this huge handbook. I think that has helped us really. I mean, it's the basis for this entire series of 4 sessions, and we're only scraping the surface of what is in this rich volume. I found this session really enlightening and interesting. I am very happy that all of you took time out of your days to be here to present, but also to the participants for putting some questions, for staying with us and engaging in here. I just put in the chat once more the information on the other sessions that you can still view online or register in the case of the upcoming session, as well as the link to the handbook. I thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and week, and we'll see each other again in the near future. Thank you very much.